Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. A privilege to be invited to speak to you today. We stand at the threshold of what may well be the greatest challenge in human history: how to feed our population sustainably through the mid-century peak in human numbers and demand for food. Now, we're all doubtless aware that there's going to be around about 9 billion people in 2050. But what is less publicised is the fact that the human population will keep on growing from that point. It's probably going to reach 10 or even 11 billion or more in the 2060s. And the world economy is not going to stop growing. So demand for meat from China, from India, from Brazil, from the newly industrialising countries is going to continue to grow, and that means demand for grain is going to grow. There's going to be massively more demand for protein food in the next 2 generations. Basically, we will be requiring of the order of 600 quadrillion calories a day to feed the human race by the 2060s. So my first point is that the central issue in the human destiny is not climate change or the global financial crisis. It is whether or not we can achieve and sustain such a harvest. My second point today: agriculture faces critical constraints, not just one or two, but a whole constellation of them, feeding into one another, and serious ones. Today there are looming scarcities of just about everything you need to produce high yields of quality food: water, land, nutrients, oil, technology, skills, fish, and stable climates. Each of these feeds into the others and compounds them. So this is not a simple problem. It can't just be fixed with technology or national policy changes. It is what is known as a wicked problem. By 2050, there will be around about 7 or 8 billion people living in the world's cities, and they will consume around about 2,800 cubic kilometres of fresh water, and that is more than the whole of irrigation worldwide uses today. Now, some of those cities may get their water from desalination, but for a lot of them, it's going to be easier and cheaper to steal it from the farmers. Then there is the slice of water that climate change is already stealing from the great grain bowls, whether it's rainfall decline in the drier areas, evaporation from storages, shrinking rivers, declining groundwater, or the loss of meltwater from mountain regions. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the Himalayan glaciers are indeed melting. The only issue is how quickly. And the North China Plain is running out of water. And those two regions together feed 1.7 billion people today, and they have to feed twice that many in future. Worldwide, groundwater levels and rivers are dropping as they are pumped dry. We've seen immense water bodies like Lake Chad, the bottom left there, virtually vanish in the last 25 years, 90% decline in the surface area of that mighty lake that supports 70 million people. We've seen what's happened in our own Murray-Darling Basin. A recent study in Nature finds that 80% of the world's big river systems are degraded. International Water Management Institute Director Colin Chartres, an Aussie, puts it this way: current estimates indicate we will not have enough water to feed ourselves in 25 years' time. Today, humanity uses about 7,450 cubic kilometres of water every year. The average individual, each one of us, uses about 1,240 tonnes, most of it in the form of food. And that's equivalent to one Olympic-sized swimming pool every 2.5 years for each one of us. It's an awful lot of water. To put our consumption in perspective, over a lifetime, each of us will use enough water to float that aircraft carrier there. So there is a massive use or overuse of water by humanity at large. We're seeing a similar picture with land. Today, around about a quarter of farmland is affected by degradation. That's up from 15% 2 decades ago. A recent satellite survey by FAO found that the world is now losing about 1% of its farmland every year to a combination of erosion, urban sprawl, mining, recreation, toxic pollution, and rising sea levels. Now, if we've already lost 24% and we lose 1% a year from here on for the next half century, you can work out for yourself how much farmland is going to be left on which to double food production. That the world may already have passed peak land is suggested by the United Nations Environment Programme graph in the bottom left there. Put it another way, between 1990 and 2005, world demand for food grew 15 times faster than the area of land being cultivated. By 2050, the area of land buried under immense megacities like this will exceed the landmass of China. And the area of land buried by recreational uses, that is horse farms, holiday properties, golf courses, etc., will equal the United States of America. Now that is nearly all prime farmland, ladies and gentlemen, because cities are naturally in river valleys and they are naturally on coastal plains. And the effect, and this is something that hasn't been factored in yet, the effect is to drive agriculture out into drier and less reliable regions worldwide. This makes the food supply less secure. We now need to understand, and I'm very pleased to say that Queensland has understood this and has passed initial legislation trying to protect prime farmland, that the word development must be understood to mean the elimination of food potential. We do need to start passing laws to stop it. Now, many of these cities, there's worse to come, many of these cities have got almost no internal food production of their own. I mean, unlike the cities of old where people kept chooks and grew vegetables, these cities produce none of their food. It comes every night on a river of trucks and trains and planes and ships. What happens when, not if, there is an oil crisis and that food cannot be delivered? What happens when a local war breaks out and prevents the delivery of food to a city of 30 or 40 million people? What is that city going to eat a week after the food is cut off? These are issues that have not yet been addressed and they need to be thought about urgently. The world is also shedding nutrients at every link in the chain. We know we lose nutrients when we spread fertiliser on farm, anything up to half of them in some cases. The resources of mineral nutrients, the ones that we mine to replace the ones that we lose, are starting to fail. The graph at the bottom right-hand corner, the chart there, shows the ratio of high-quality phosphorus reserves to low-quality phosphorus reserves. We're not actually running out of phosphorus, but the low-quality stuff takes 3 times as much oil and 3 times the cost to extract, as does the high quality. So we're running through the high quality. The high quality is controlled by 3 countries: Morocco, China and the United States of America. And China has already embargoed exports of phosphorus because they want to keep it for their farmers. So we're running into a situation where phosphorus fertilisers are likely to get very expensive and probably without much warning. Canadian physicist Patrick Derry calculated we actually passed peak phosphorus, that is, the demand started to outrun supply, known supply, in 1989. Other people differ, but it's the writing on the wall, basically. We have to rethink the way we do nutrients. So if these prices, the same thing applies to natural gas, which is a primary ingredient in nitrogenous fertilisers. Peak gas will follow soon after peak oil, sometime in the coming decade. So all of these things are likely to affect the cost of these vital inputs. The flip side of this is the waste issue. In developed countries like Australia and America and the European community, every family throws that amount of food in the garbage every single month. Half of your efforts, ladies and gentlemen, is going to landfill. This is a disgraceful system. I don't know how we've done that. The Stockholm Institute, bottom left, calculates that we currently waste 2,600 out of every 4,600 kilocalories harvested. Now, some of it's lost post-harvest, an awful lot of it is just trashed. Our grandparents would say we were idiots, and I'd say they'd be right. Peak oil is not a theory. It has already happened in the United States, it's already happened in Australia, in Britain, and in 49 out of 65 of the world's oil-producing regions. In fact, there's considerable evidence it's happened in Saudi Arabia now. Just as farmers have got little control over who snatches their water, or their land for that matter, they have little control over who snatches their oil. Now, as oil becomes increasingly expensive, and we saw it hit $160 a barrel in 2008, it's back up to $100. There are predictions in the US economic forecasting institutions of it going to $200 or $300 if there is a world oil crisis sometime in the next 10 years. So this is going to affect very much not only the price of oil, but also its availability to farming communities worldwide, and especially those farming communities that are just starting to mechanise. So, you know, they will have to get rid of their tractors or something. In fact, that's what happened in 2008. If you were breeding water buffalo in Thailand, you would have made a fortune because the farmers had to sell their tractors and buy buffalo. Our food system is critically dependent on this vanishing resource. Every single one of us in a year eats the distillate from 66 barrels of oil. So one of the most critical problems that we have to solve is where is the energy going to come from to power the trucks and the harvesters and the pumps that make our farming systems work. There are plenty of energy sources, but we have not yet developed the alternative. You could, of course, grow lots of canola and stick that in the tank and produce your own electricity on farm. But you know, if every farmer in the world did that, it would lower world food production by 10%, right when we're trying to double it. And if you grew enough oil to supply the trucks that cart the food to Woolies and Coles, then that would reduce world food supply by 30%. So growing farm fuels is not an answer to the farm fuel crisis. It may be a solution in a few regional areas, but it is not a long-term solution. We need a new energy source for agriculture, and we need it now before oil takes off. Why? Because, you know, consumers might get a little irate if they saw bread prices going to $30 a loaf. That little kick at the extreme right-hand end of the graph is where grain prices, world grain prices, moved to when oil was $160 a barrel. Okay? Go back to 1974 and look what happened to world grain prices when there was a real oil crisis on. They went up by 200 to 400%. That's a reality that I think the governments of the world have not got their little heads around. We're seeing something fairly ominous happening in the oceans. Scientists tell us that 29% of the world's fisheries have now collapsed. Another 30% are in trouble. 30% are hanging in there. But they could be gone if we don't develop more farming systems. Now, what this means, even if we develop sustainable fishing, which is still a questionable thing, even if we do, we are not going to be able to double protein production from the oceans. We are not going to get another 100 million tonnes of fish out of the sea. So that means that's 100 million tonnes of protein that has to come from land-based livestock industries, including fish. To produce 100 million tonnes of meat requires 1 billion tonnes of grain. And if you add to that, this is just to give you a picture of the scale of the agricultural challenge. If you add to that the 185 million tonnes of meat, which FAO says humanity is going to demand by 2050 anyway through natural growth, then basically we need to discover 3 more North Americas to grow enough grain to feed that many livestock. That gives you an idea of how large the challenge is. All this is happening at a time of increasing climate unpredictability. Our crops and our farming systems are adapted to climates which are about to become extinct, is the way Dr. Kerry Fowler, who runs the Svalbard Seed Vault, puts it. The UK's Hadley Centre, who've got the world's best climate models, ran those models over the last century, and they reproduced the climate that happened in the 20th century. They ran them forward to see what would happen in the 21st century, and what they ended up with was roughly 40% of the world in regular drought by the end of this century. So it's currently, in a given year, you have about 10% of the planet in drought somewhere or other. You know, the Black Sea region and Western Australia being examples currently. But what they're talking about is a 4-fold increase in that. And the ice caps are not going to melt fast enough that we're going to be able to farm Siberia to make up for that loss. So there's going to be a crunch for a period of time until we do open up the high north, when it's going to be pretty hard to grow grain in a lot of the areas that we traditionally have. People have pinned their hopes on places like Brazil. The Brazilian Agriculture Department says, oh, we can get another 300 million tonnes of grain from the Cerrado. But the Cerrado soils are acidic, they're light, they need a lot of fertiliser, so they're dependent on these fossil inputs that are going to become scarce. And also, according to the Hadley Centre, their map of world soil moisture content shows that actually Brazil is going to get quite a lot drier. And so is India, you might notice. So a few key regions which we have been relying on for food production are going to become an awful lot more unpredictable. Nobody really knows how much climate change is going to affect world food production. The current consensus of scientific papers that I've read suggests a reduction of about 25% in world food supply based upon business as usual farming systems. If we keep on doing what we're doing today, we will reduce world food production by about a quarter. We'll lose about a quarter of it. If we adapt, of course, we may be able to maintain it, but adaptation is a big challenge. And CSIRO has already made the point that if Australia does not adapt, we will start importing grain in about 2050. So adaptation, all those new varieties that you've just been talking about, is absolutely critical. The Global Footprint Network, who estimate how much of the Earth's resources humanity is using year on year, now say that we're using about 1 1/3 planet's worth of resources every single year. So we're working the bank card overtime, ladies and gentlemen. We're putting the Earth into resource debt. Basically, they say if we don't change the way and this isn't just agriculture, this is all our systems, energy and minerals and things like that. If we don't change our current rates of consumption, we will need 2 planets to supply our wants by the year 2050. So change is coming whether we like it or not. I take from this a message about agriculture that basically today's food production systems worldwide and today's diets are not sustainable. And we therefore need to reinvent them. And of course, many of you are already in the process of doing just that. You are designing better systems for coping with the more unpredictable conditions to come. But most of the world is not doing that. Most of the world is sitting still, and that's the worry. To sum it up, this is the challenge that your grandchildren or great-grandchildren on the farm will face. They will have to double their food output using half the present water, with far less land, with no fossil fuels, with very expensive fertilisers, less technology. Why? Because you've just heard, countries around the world are not investing in agricultural science and technology like they used to do, and under an increasingly unpredictable climate. The issue really is that we can address many of these things with knowledge, but at the moment, that is failing. Farmers are going to have to do this with less science and technology than they have had in the last 2 or 3 decades. And the reason is that governments all over the world have taken their foot off the agricultural science accelerator. Australia has reduced the amount of ag research it does, so has the United States, so has Britain, so has Brazil, for heaven's sake, so has China. They are all putting their science dollar elsewhere. In 2000, the rich countries of the world invested only 1.8 cents in every research dollar in food production. So unimportant has this area become to them. Today, the world invests around about $40 billion a year in science and technology for agriculture. But we spend $1,500 billion a year on weapons to kill one another. So the point is that there's plenty of money to save ourselves if we want it. It just needs to be reinvested slightly. Now, the effect of this disinvestment in agricultural R&D, if you look at the CGIAR, that's the International Agricultural Research effort, that red line, basically it looks like the heartbeat of a dead patient on a cardiac monitor. They haven't increased significantly the amount of money going into international agricultural research since the mid-1970s. That gives you an idea of what's actually going on. And the outcome, basically, is that agricultural productivity worldwide is not keeping pace with the growth in food demand due to the combination of population and increasing demand for food in rich countries. We're seeing, the rate of increase in crop yields, particularly in the developing world, of key crops like wheat and maize and so on, has fallen away fairly dramatically. We're not achieving the breakthroughs that we were achieving back in the 1960s and 70s. And this has created a lag in the system. The technologies you need for tomorrow, there are going to be fewer of them. They're not going to be so widely available. This is something that really has to change. And while we're at it, I think also it's really important that we end what I think is a rather silly argument over who has the best farming system. Is it the organic producers, or is it the guys with the high-intensity, highly modern farming systems? I say that we need the best ideas from both systems to build the new eco-agriculture, to bring these two strands of agricultural thought together so that we can produce an agricultural environment that does produce far more using much less energy, less inputs of pesticides and fertilisers and other things, and which is essentially a sustainable system. This is the new eco-agriculture which it is our task over this generation to develop. And I would argue that this is actually humanity's most urgent scientific challenge. It's more urgent than curing cancer, and it's probably more urgent than curing climate change, because we actually know how to cure climate change. All we have to do is implement it. This system of farming has to work for all kinds of farmers, not just the big guys and not just the small guys. It has to work for farmers large and small in every country in the world. Okay, we really need to put our brains together with our fellow farmers everywhere to make this happen. Because if we fail, the consequences will be profound. Modern wars are often driven by scarcities of food, land and water. Darfur, Rwanda, Eritrea, the Balkans were all destabilised at root by squabbles over these basic resources. If you go further back in history, the King of France got his head cut off and the Tsar of Russia was shot by revolutions that grew out of bread riots. We know that hunger breeds war. The UK Ministry of Defence, who developed this threat map of the world showing where the conflicts are, America's CIA, the US Centre for Strategic and International Studies, the Oslo Peace Research Institute, all identify hunger as a potential trigger for revolution, government collapse and war, including possibly nuclear. Where's the evidence? The evidence is before our eyes in just the last 4 weeks. Governments in Tunisia and Egypt fell as a result of protests that began with people protesting the price and availability of food. So we've seen governments torn down within this year over a failure to deliver efficient agriculture, basically. However, the good news is that you can also avoid war. If you can secure the food supply, you can prevent war. And this is the message that the politicians need to get. The other dimension is migration. There's currently 250 million people migrating around the world, both internally and externally. But this is nothing compared to the migrations that will ensue if we have a major food failure in a country such as India or China or North Africa, or Africa generally, or Latin America. Then there will be tens of millions of people on the move, and no country will be immune for the consequences of that. Okay, so what are the solutions? First of all, we must redouble the global investment in agricultural science. We need to spend $80 billion a year on that, and I argue we need to spend another $80 billion getting that knowledge into the hands of 1.8 billion farmers, male and female, worldwide. We must develop the greatest knowledge-sharing effort in history, using all the modern communication technologies that are now available. That's what makes it possible. Where's the money to come from? Well, if you took just 10% of the defence budgets of the world, you could do this. You could do it easily. Sorry, we need to end the waste. We have to stop throwing away half the food that we produce or losing it en route to market. We have to recycle the lost nutrients back into farming systems, back into food-producing systems. That means essentially redesigning our cities and our diets to go with them. It means, for example, greening our cities. It means cities actually growing some of their own food, because a city today is nothing but a huge mine of nutrients and water. If you recycle what flows through Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane today into local food-producing industries, into peri-urban industries, into agriculture, at Goondiwindi and elsewhere, you can sustain the world farming system. At the moment, we're chucking it into the Pacific, and that has to end. I think we need to produce a lot more fresh vegetables intensively in urban areas because they are very efficient in terms of land and water, and they will be necessary in the world diet. There is also opportunity for biocultures. This is the culture of microbial, plant, animal and fungal genes, microbial cells in culture using the nutrients from the cities. They can provide a base underpinning that will save these great cities from the threat of starvation. We basically need to redesign the world diet, because I can tell you that there is not going to be enough meat grown on the planet to feed everybody like an Australian. Essentially, I think we're going to have to eat a lot more vegetables, and look, the adventure has only just begun. There are 1,000 vegetables currently being eaten by Indigenous societies around the world that have never been farmed. They've never been farmed or made available in developed societies such as ours. So this is a culinary adventure, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be interesting. It's going to change some really fundamental things, because currently half of all Australians die as a result of their diet. Half of Americans die as a result of their diet. It's not a particularly good diet. So we need something like this to balance it. I see livestock going back to the rangelands for several reasons. First of all, because of the high prices of grain and oil, but also because the rangelands are the biggest area of land in the world, and you can lock up the most carbon on that. And using precision pastoralism and new advanced grazing systems, you can regenerate these rangelands by running fewer stock, growing healthy, organic beef, sheep meat, goat meat, whatever it is. You can actually bring back those rangelands, whether it's Mongolia, which is the nice green one up in the top there, or our own pastoral country in Australia, which has been sorely neglected the last 40 years. But basically we can produce healthy, organic, but much higher priced meat that returns a far better price to the grazier than today's industrialised product does. We can also farm the deserts. That is a system designed by an architect basically for using sunlight to process seawater or salt water for growing crops of various kinds. But we're not going to be able to do this without the support of consumers. We need to change the attitudes of those 8 billion people who will live in the cities in future. The most ambitious educational campaign on earth to install 1 full year, a food year, in every junior school on the planet. This is a year when every subject, whether it's maths or language or geography, science, society or sport, is taught through the lens of food. How precious it is, how it is produced, who produces it, where it comes from, how to eat it safely, thriftily and healthily, how to help ensure as a consumer that your food supply never fails by supporting the farmers who grow it. Now, teaching food is acceptable in all cultures and creeds. Teaching respect for food and how it is produced is equally so. And we already have the means to share this knowledge worldwide. So we need to get on with it. But we need the food processing industry behind us. We need the agriculture and food departments and health departments. We need the TV chefs and nutritionists behind us. We need everyone to join hands on this one to create this lighter, healthier, less energy intense world diet. It'll be much more diverse, much more interesting than we have today, but it won't kill quite so many people. The message is eat well, but eat less. Eat more vegetables and less energy-intensive foods. Choose foods that spare our soil and water. Be happy to pay more for such food so our farmers can protect the precious environment in which it grows. Today, ladies and gentlemen, Australians have got the cheapest food in human history. They pay 1/3 what their grandparents paid for it and half what their parents paid for it. But it is damaging our landscapes, our water and our farming communities. It is killing consumers and it is prompting colossal waste. It is too cheap to last. So it is imperative that in the coming decades we do two things. First of all, abolish all trade barriers so that food can flow naturally, production can flow naturally to the places that are most efficient. And second, start paying farmers a fair income. I mean, every other bastard in society gets a fair income. For some reason or other, farmers worldwide don't. The prices that globalised food chains now pay farmers will end up destroying agriculture, its resource base and its surrounding ecosystems. And we need to change that. We need to change the fundamental economics of agriculture. Farmers don't just grow food. They also look after 40% of the world's land, 3/4 of its water, 1/3 of its atmosphere, most of its wildlife. And they need society's support to do that. I think they should be paid to do that. Farmers are the most important human beings alive in terms of the coming issues facing the human race. But humanity and governments have forgotten this, and they need to be reminded. Given our history, our skills, and our resilient and generous character, Australia should lead the world in this endeavour. This is a shining challenge, ladies and gentlemen, both inspiring and well within our powers. And I believe it is once more Australia's destiny to serve humanity in this way and help to avert the coming famine. Thank you very much.
We're all trying to make a living for ourselves at the moment, which is challenging. Now the world is going to, at some stage, expect farmers to feed the world. We can all see the writing on the wall. You've just said it. Why are we expecting 80% of our funding comes directly from us to feed the world? Why does the expectation keep coming back to us? And you summed it up at the end saying that farmers need a fair go. Well, the rest of the world's got to learn to respect that. Milk and bread from Woolworths and Coles for $2 isn't going to solve that.
That's why I'm putting out this message now, warning that the things that farmers need to produce food are becoming very scarce, and farmers need society's help, and they need massive reinvestment. The FAO says we have to plough $80 billion a year into agriculture if we hope to double food production. And that is not going to happen if agriculture is unprofitable. People don't put their money in industries that are unprofitable. Unfortunately, agriculture is being driven down by a very, very small number of very large companies. Supermarkets, global supermarket chains, and food processing companies are doing their best to lower commodity prices because they want to supply their consumers with the cheapest food. So that's driving prices down. On the other hand, you've got integration in the big farm suppliers pushing input prices up. So the cost price squeeze now, I think, is more intense than ever in history. We have to arrest that. That is not the natural way of things. We have to put in a wedge there that will enable farmers to get back in there. Now, there are lots of ways that we can reinforce farming incomes and regenerate investment in agriculture. I haven't got time to discuss all of those, but one of them I put to you quite easy. If you put GST on food and you remitted the 10% directly to farmers on condition they use it in land care and other farm sustainability improvements, then I think that that could supplement the prices that they get for commodities on the free market. So that's one way you could do it. The Europeans actually already do something like that, so it's not impossible.
Climate effect on world production. The rigor seems to rest with the temperature rise. They then extrapolated to extreme events, etc. And the other rigor rests with the carbon dioxide. I would have thought both those things tend to increase production, certainly where there was adequate moisture, and possibly countered somewhat by expanding the deserts at the other end without really driving production down, at least maintain it.
I'm going to give you a bit of my limited understanding of climatology. Under climate change, if you look at a map of the world and you spin the globe of the world, you'll notice there's these big yellow bands on either side of the equator, around about 30 degrees out. Now those are the deserts, and just to the north and south of them are the grain growing regions. Under climate change, basically what is going to happen is that the whole Earth system, those systems are drier, okay? Those yellow belts around the Earth are drier because the air rises over the equator, sheds its moisture, and then drops over the world's grain belts. And has the moisture being gone, there are fewer clouds to actually form rainfall. So that produces the ideal environment for grasses to grow, hence the grain belts and the savannas. So those belts are going to expand under climate change. We're already seeing this in Australia, that the whole of the climatic system is tending to move south, which means that we're actually losing our good wheat growing country into the Great Southern Ocean. The consensus at the moment seems to be that we may lose grain production as the world's current grain belts dry out quicker than we can open up and drain new land in Russia and Siberia and Canada, because that's very, very wet country. As for carbon dioxide, yes, you do get a small increase in plant production under CO2, but it's pretty much cancelled out by heat and by pests and by other factors. So it isn't the benefit that scientists once hoped it would be. You might get 3 or 4% yield improvement from it, but not the 10s and 20% that they were hoping for.
What would be your 5 steps to actually cause the change that you're talking about? And who would we need to influence when to put those, for example, 5 steps into practice?
If we don't change the economic signals, farming will continue to stagger along. We have to give farmers the economic incentive to reinvest in agriculture, in new technologies and sustainable technologies. I don't think that the economic systems that have prevailed for the last 30 years are going to deliver a doubling in the world food supply, especially under very high prices. 3, we must have a new energy source for agriculture. I mean, this is really urgent because the next oil crisis could be only weeks away. We don't know when one of those Middle East countries is going to fall over. I mean, look how many of them have fallen over in the last month. We are living on a knife edge with regard to the energy inputs to agriculture at the moment and all the other inputs that depend on energy. And the other one, which I think is really important, is this one of changing the world diet. We have to, our consumers have so little respect for food and for how it is produced and for the people that grow it and for the ecosystem, the agricultural ecosystem that produces it, that they just throw it in the garbage. And I think we are the first generation in human history to treat our food with such disrespect. So when I say we need a year of food education in every primary school on the planet, that's serious. We have to teach 8 billion citizens of the world's future cities who will never go on a farm that they have to respect their food and they have to pay a fair price to the farmer so the farmer can look after the landscape or the resources that produce that food. Because if that doesn't happen, you will see large cracks opening up in the sustainability of the food supply. They may not happen here in Australia, but if they happen big time in Asia, we will cop the backwash. So this is a strategic investment. We need to regard agriculture as defence spending, because it's what's actually going to protect the world against conflict and mass migration.